Well, so we are working as an association. We are working quite closely with the Namibia Film Commission because we have an MOU with them. So we then are basically the industry's voice and representative. And so the industry needs is then what we communicate to the NFC, and they then try to create sort of like KPIs around the needs of the industry alongside the Ministry of MICT.
Yes.
So we do have small budgets coming in from the MICT, but film, because it's considered as an audiovisual industry, it's obviously now sits under the audiovisual department under MICT.
Yes.
However, film is also part of the creative sector.
Yes.
It's also an art. So we are then also sort of like sitting at the arts, with the Ministry of Arts or MASEC as we're calling it these days.
Yes.
And so we're in between the two ministries. But I think this year it was a little bit different because with the help of MASEC and NFC, we were then able to sit around the table when it came to planning for or at least being part of the national planning workshop. So we were part of that workshop, and we contributed in terms of the industry's needs, and we contributed in identifying programs, that could be, part of the development plan, and then obviously that would necessitate certain budgeting.
Yes.
So obviously, if a ministry or if the National Planning Commission doesn't know what a ministry needs and what programs they've identified need budgeting, obviously they can't make provision for that.
Okay.
So I think like a lot of the times in the past, we haven't been sitting in these rooms because we don't understand the process that government goes through for them to actually allocate certain budgets to certain ministries.
Yes.
So for example, the visual artist could have gone to MASEC and said, these are the programs we've identified within our industry because these are our needs and this is how we justify them.
Yes.
They then receive the budget, or at least, to a certain degree, part of the budget. But if they don't hear anything from the film side, they can't, consider us for any budgeting.
Yes.
So we were very privileged and honored to be part of that conversation, which was, I think, very important.
Yes.
And also the association has been dormant since COVID.
Okay.
And so there hasn't been much action happening. So we had to sort of like do a lot of groundwork. We had to learn a lot as well about government proceedings, and then also be part of the important conversations.
Very good, very good. Before we continue in that vein, let's just look at the status quo up to now, and especially going through COVID and in recent years. Would you say that money available for the industry, does it make its way down to actors, filmmakers, to the actual people who need to use it to produce?
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. It's sad to say that, but I think also it comes from the lack of understanding of the ecosystem of film.
Yes.
Right? A lot of times we are classified with the creative industry, but our ecosystem is very different from, the performing artist or the visual artist.
Yes.
Like the painter, for example, because our sector sort of involves a lot of the other sectors, because we hire caterers, we hire, we contribute to logistics, hospitality, we rope in your makeup artists, we rope in accounting services, the banks as well. So, there's a lot of like bank charges that go off because we're paying all of these people, and these are many transactions that are going through. So, and I think that because the government doesn't understand this ecosystem and the potential thereof, it has sort of like been looked down on. And I think that there needs to be sort of like more awareness and also more willingness from the government itself to try and understand, okay, how does this ecosystem function and how do we better support them, right? We can also only do so much in terms of, seeking audiences. But if we don't get those audiences and if we don't get into rooms where we can actually explain ourselves and actually define the value, that comes from film, and also the potential it has in terms of, job creation and GDP contribution, it's massive. But I think it's been undermined and it's been misunderstood a lot in the past years. And I think now that the president has, highlighted that as one of our main goals, I think there's a little bit more interest coming from the ministries and coming from even just private sector in wanting to sort of like, dissect and wanting to understand, okay, how do we support them? And what is the value and what does the return on investment look like for us as well? So I think these are the conversations that we're trying to have with private sector and as well as with government to try and justify why we need more budgeting.
Yes, yes. I was in a conversation with a colleague just the other day who mentioned that she thinks that the quality of the work that we do produce that comes out of Namibia is very high considering how little you have to work with. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, like I've gone to quite a few film premieres, local film premieres, and you ask the producer at the end of the night, and you ask them, how much did you work with? And they give you the budget, and you're like, wow. So a lot of times they can only just afford to pay for certain services, and sometimes they even have to top up with their own personal money to produce, the content. But if we had invested more into that content would then have the potential to actually travel past our borders. And that's what we tried to do, for example, with our film, The Skeleton Coast. We had to really sacrifice a lot of investment to put into that because we wanted to appeal to the international markets because unfortunately that is where sort of like your market is. That's where your distribution sits, right? Because there you get the off-take agreements and that's where you can get your money back. Here we are still struggling in terms of distribution. NBC as well, we're still, continuing conversations because I think they also have a certain quality that they look for, but they also don't have, enough budgets to pay for the content. So we're trying to see how do we meet each other halfway, considering the budgets that we are getting from not just MICT, but also from the arts ministry as well.
And the message that's contained in many of these productions. Previously, it has often been said that, especially for Africa, Africa needs to tell African stories. We need to tell our stories to the world. Do you think that Namibian productions are able to do that, or are they caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of the financial and the realities that you just have to cater to an international market and say what they want to hear?
So I think it needs to be a balance between both, right? Because film is used to create a certain narrative or communicate a certain narrative or even promote certain awarenesses. However, at the same time, you also need to create film that establishes a country's identity, right? Okay. So if we want to sort of like, preserve our identity as a country and to hone in on our past and, sort of create films around our history and our potential, present and future, we need to create content that speaks to Namibian people and that speaks to the identity of a Namibian person. However, on the other side, there's also the commercial side of things, right? And the commercial side of things is what actually pays the bills. And it's less of a passion project, it's more of a commercial strategy that you have to then approach because you then want to sell your product. And if the international market is saying that this is the kind of content that's popular right now, then you go for it or you try and create something similar. So if Netflix is saying that right now we are purchasing good film movies or we want to focus on Christmas or love stories, you try and create content that speaks to that because you want to be able to sell your content, right? It doesn't I can't now impose on Netflix and say, listen, I want to tell the story, so you better just buy it. I mean, companies, they know what's working for them. They've got the metrics. I mean, they know, they get the data and they see who's watching what. So if the majority of the viewers are watching a specific type of content, unfortunately, you have to align to that unless if it's such a different concept, that's like Wakanda or something like that. I think obviously, you need to make room for one or two, but even those ones require high budgeting.
And do we have any success in breaking into those more lucrative markets? Have we had any success?
Currently not. I think that, well, there was Bahu and the Giant. I think at the time Netflix was trying to focus on creating awareness around rhino poaching.
Okay.
So Florian Schott's Bahu and the Giant was temporarily on Netflix.
I see.
And they got in there. Other than that, no, nothing from Namibia.
Okay.
Yeah.
The title of the book is The Bushman Myth Revisited, Genocide, Dispossession, and the Road to Civility. And it's based on a book which I wrote 40 years ago called The Bushman Myth, The Making of a Namibian Underclass, which is unavailable in Namibia because it's too expensive. Even now, second-hand copies cost 600 NAM dollars. So a lot of people in Namibia said, why don't you make it accessible to the people where it counts? And so I managed to persuade UNAM Press to publish it in a low-cost version.
Okay.
And it's updated a lot, and with genocide becoming a very important topic, it focuses on the Bushman genocide.
Wow, that's very important actually, because we always hear pockets of genocide having been committed against the Bushmen, but there's very little literature about it. So that will come in handy. What motivated the subject?
Oh, well, I'm an anthropologist, or I used to be one. Now I prefer to call myself a documentalist. When I grew up in Keetmanshoop, as a small kid, we'd go on holiday to Ludritz. And one of my biggest impressions as a 10-year-old was in the museum there was this photograph of Bushmen hanging from a tree. And then we looked, you look at the way Bushmen are imagined nowadays, and it's, the gods must be crazy. These are people living in a pristine life in the Kalahari. In fact, Trivial Pursuit, the South African edition, which is a very popular game, says, oh, the Bushmen are extinct, the San have always lived in the Kalahari. So I'm trying to bridge that, and I'm looking at the process of extinction, and of course it's absolutely not true. They're thriving. So I'm sort of looking at the dark side of history. That inspired me, and then I discovered, to my horror, that picture of the Bushman hanging from a tree was actually photographed in Keetmanshoop, my hometown.
Wow, man.
So that really inspired me. And then I visited Sumkwe in about 1989 and saw living conditions there. So I decided there are over 2,500 scholarly articles on people in the Kalahari Basin. I mean, it's been anthropologists, linguists, physicians, even dentists have worked on it. But no one has really looked at the larger picture of the role of Bushmen or San within the wider settler society. So that's been my particular focus, is looking at that. And then here's an interesting statistic. The last German census in 1913 officially estimated that there were between 9,000 and 12,000 Bushmen. The first South African census in 1923 listed them as 3,600. So even allowing for estimates being way off, no one can deny that there was a significant decrease in the number of Bushmen. One anthropologist said it was malaria, which is problematic because the other people in the vicinity didn't die of malaria. So I got interested in that, and then I was reading this diary. Now, what you've got to understand, in 1915, the South African troops were invading from the south, vastly outnumbering the Germans. But the Germans were so concerned about, quote, Bushman depredations in the Grootfontein district, they had to send a special detachment of 60 troops to go and deal with Bushman depredations. And the press was alive from 1912 with headlines, the Bushman plague, the yellow danger, which from a Bushman perspective, of course, is the settler plague and the white danger. And there was a lot of resistance because what happened was after the genocidal wars. They built a railway line up to Tsumeb. That's prime farming area, and the Germans decided one of the ways they're going to prevent uprisings is bringing in German settlers. So they brought in a lot, and Grootfontein district was one of the most attractive areas for agriculture, and so the number of farms rose from 15 to 175, so there was this massive input. And these German settlers had three things which were facilitated genocide. First of all, they were racist. Secondly, they were inexperienced farmers. They were mostly police soldiers who had been discharged on favorable terms. And thirdly, they were mostly single men. And we know what happens when a bunch of single men comes together. Violence is going to occur. It's a sure thing. And then the third thing is, you know what was the largest source of income in this country before the discovery of diamonds?
Not at all.
Taxes on liquor.
Oh.
There was, by my estimation, there was 1 bar for every 73 settlers.
Wow.
So you have a lot of drunkenness, which is plays an important role in genocide. You have all these single men. What do? Paul Rohrbach, who was the commissioner for settlement, was stuck in Grootfontein during the Herero-Nama War, writes, these single settlers, they have a concubine. Having a concubine is as common as having breakfast. And in fact, in 1923, Austrian anthropologist studied first-generation Bushman German kids, and there were 23 of them in Windhoek at the Catholic school, so it was a lot. And one of the main reasons for Bushman action and resistance to the German settlers was because they were taking Bushman women as concubines and, let's say, raping them too. Concubine is a nice euphemism covering a lot of stuff. So those were the conditions which facilitated it. Then in 1915, this guy Walbaum, a German settler, reservist who was up in Grootfontein, in his diary describes a Bushman hunt. And he says, we would creep up and there were a bunch of Bushmen collecting eentjies in the field, and we stood up and they stood up shocked, and we said, walk in front of us. And they shot them. And he says, I missed. Then they captured one and they tied him to a tree because they said he knew about a farm which they'd raided. And he said, I will tell everything. And they said, we don't believe you. So they hung him up. And then he says, you know what's interesting? When you hang a person, you can see the veins swell in their legs. You know, this banal type of stuff going on. So anyway, the first thing the South African magistrate in Grootfontein said, this practice known as Bushman hunting must stop in 1915. But the local German settlers carried on shooting Bushmen, and they would brag about it to the South African military and get imprisoned, but get released on. So it was a real big thing. And in fact, if you read missionary records, there were over 400 anti-Bushman patrols between 1911 and 1912. This is before the census, so you can imagine. And they just describe, there are 250 Bushmen who've been imprisoned in Grootfontein. In fact, what was happening is because of the shortage of labor, the vast number of Bushmen were farm laborers. In fact, Grootfontein district would have collapsed without Bushman farm labor. Over half of the labor force in those days was by Bushmen, and they would go and capture them and try and force them. And then there was this debate, Bushmen are untamable. So how do you tame them? How do you habituate them to work? And then one of the things was, we'll send the men off to the diamond mines, and we'll take the kids and we'll habituate them to the dignity of labor by placing them with selected farmers. So you had families being separated to try and get Bushmen to be decent. Wow. The other thing which is important too is what the scientists were saying. And there were several scientists, prominent Franz Steiner, Siegfried Passage, and they said, what do you do with these predators like Bushmen? You can only shoot them. And there's a lot of scientific evidence saying, they're useless. Even so, you've got the scientific credibility to shooting Bushmen because, there's this link between humans and animals. Yeah, they're not humans. So that also promotes this. So anyway,
Okay.
I can go on for a
Yeah,
long time. talking
absolutely. No, it's good history. So would the book, if I read the book, would it give me a sense of? I mean, let's talk about the Bushman resistance. These are nomadic people, primitive, quite primitive at the time in terms of adopting new technologies and whatnot. How did they stage any resistance?
Well, first of all, they're not nomadic people. This is one of the big myths which goes into the idea of, they occupy land, they don't own it.
Yeah, because I wanted you to explain actually also that part, whether they actually land that you could say this one
They
belongs
have
to.
a very intricate land use system called Nores, but you also have a very strong sense of territoriality, that you don't go into someone else's land. So what the settlers were saying, let's create a reserve over on the other side of the police zone.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't work because of territoriality. And of course, the reason why they wanted to have a police zone there is they wanted to get rid of the Bushmen in the police zone. And in fact, the vast majority of Bushmen lived on farms eventually because they didn't want to move. And there they became servile. There was this idea of discipline, sort of neo-feudalism, the lord of the manor. I can punish you, I can whip you if you need to be. But I'm offering you protection, which is, of course, facile. So there's that thing. The other thing which is very important is they know let's go back into history. In 1852, when the first white hunters come, and what are they doing? They're looking for ivory and ostrich feathers. And Bushmen become local guides. In fact, the world record for shooting the largest number of elephants was 103 in one day in a mud flat which was north of Tsumkwe in 1872 or somewhere around there. But what the great white hunter, a guy called Hendrik van Zyl, neglected to mention was that he did very little of the shooting. Most of it was done by Bushman hunters because they would say, okay, you shoot, you take the risk, because shooting elephants in those days is a risky business. Yeah. You keep the meat, we'll take the ivory. Who's exploiting who? Yeah. So they were appreciated for it. But then that started changing with the abolition of firearms and the colonial state. So, I've got a sketch from 1852 of Bushmen carrying firearms. Oh. They were well armed, and this feeds into their resistance. In fact, they were the victors in the First Namibian War of Independence, which was the Republic of Uppingtonia. I don't know if you know about that. There was this guy called Will Worthington Jordan, because Tsumeb, that area's got lots of minerals, and which were originally mined by Bushmen, and he wanted to take it over, but resistance was so strong that he created the Republic of Uppingtonia and invited the Angola Boers to go and settle there. But the Bushman resistance after Jordan got killed was such that the Boers gave up, and they pleaded with Goering, who was in charge of the Namibian colonial administration, to be integrated into Deutsche Südwestafrika. So they were strong, and in fact in 1895, Leutwein signs a treaty with Bushman Captain Aribo, basically ceding him a large swath of land, including the Etosha Game Park, which of course the Germans ignored later on, but that's par for the course. But they were strongly armed, and there was a lot of what the authorities called banditry, but which other people you could reinterpret as saying, actually, this is resistance. Yeah. And in fact, the Catholic mission said, with all this land being taken over when they engage in stock theft. That's their form of taxation because these settlers have taken over their land.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So have I answered your question?
No, you have actually.